Hey everyone, this is Scott from certmedia.com, and in this video I'll be covering all-in-one WP security and firewall. This is a free plugin that is used by quite a lot of users, and it has more options than it probably should. It's kind of like a competitor to iThemes more than WordFence because it really lacks a decent scanner functionality. Now there is a scanner, but this is fairly limited compared to that of WordFence. And as it mentions here, you have to sign up for it at site-scanners.com. But we're now going to go ahead and jump through the general settings if you're using this plugin. If you're using this plugin and you don't like to get too far into the weeds, you might be better off just using WordFence and then using it with Cloudflare, and that should give you probably just as good protection without all the headache, and you get the benefit of a scanner. So when you open it up, you get your nice dashboard information. This allows you to enable critical features that it recommends you activate, an admin username, blah, 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 and you can enable and disable a maintenance mode. At the top, you have system information. This is mostly meant for debugging. You have a locked IP addresses. These are a list of IP addresses that are locked out. A permanent block list of IPs that you choose to block forever, and then a general log file for the plugin. Underneath the settings window, though, is where you can finally start making some changes. But to start under the general settings, this allows you to quickly and easily turn off a bunch of features, such as the firewall rules and security features. You do this if you're trying to debug an issue that will probably arise if you're using a fairly complicated website. And then naturally, of course, you can enable debug mode for this plugin. Under the htaccess file, you can choose to back up your htaccess file and restore it. My recommendation is you make sure you have a proper off-site backup situation, whether that means you're paying for Updraft Plus and you're backing up to a Google Drive account, or you're paying somebody for a maintenance plan to maintain your website. Either way, make sure you're storing your backups off-site and that they're able to be restored in a fairly easy manner. I had a guy who recently was backing up files on the same server and had issues with restoring them because his site was hacked, essentially. I'm not going to go too far into the details. Long story short, site was hacked. His backups were also in the same situation, and I had to manually clean everything up. Under the wp-config.php file, you can also choose to back it up or restore it. I'm a little bit wary of you using wp-config as a backup and restore under this option. I wouldn't recommend doing it unless you've made any major changes, because restoring it could cause an issue where your site gets a white screen of death, among other issues if you've made critical changes. But the first option is you can remove the WordPress generator meta tag. Whether this is a real means of security, I highly doubt, but I just like to keep the header as clean as possible, so removing that is a good thing in my book. You can import and export all of your settings. That is that. Then you have the advanced settings, which allows you to choose how IP addresses are retrieved. You can use remote address. If you're using Cloudflare, you can choose to use the Cloudflare connecting header, the forwarded to, and the HTTP client. Typically, the default option is sufficient for most websites. Then we get to the user account settings. The first thing is you need to make sure that your admin account is not using the username as admin. That is the first thing every bot tries when it goes to your website. Admin and administrator. They brute force it, and that's just the most common one. Don't ever use it. Display name, as it mentions here, modify accounts with identical login and display names. Your display name on the front end should not be the same thing as your account name. And I've already done that, so I have nothing to worry about. Password tool allows you to just type in a random password, and it will give you a nice little ranking of how strong that password is. Here's something that's interesting, though. You could just do 999999999 forever, and you can effectively get a infinitely unhackable password. After a certain digit, it just automatically turns over. So you can get 4 days, but if you add 3 more nines, nines, now it's uncrackable. I don't really pay too much attention to this. Just make sure you're using a complicated password. Don't reuse it for anything that's essential. meaning for your bank account, don't have the same thing as your email, so on and so forth. User login. This is the login lockdown feature. This is to help prevent brute forcing. As I mentioned, this is what actually turns it on. You can allow an unlock request, which will send a link to their email to unlock their account if they guess their password incorrectly too many times, or it determines that they may be a bot. You could then choose to also display a generic message when the login attempt fails. I recommend doing this. The reason for that is because if you don't, a user who guesses an incorrect username, for instance, will be alerted that the username was not found. But if they guess the correct username but the wrong password, it could tell them this username was detected, but the password does not match. So using a generic message saying this login is incorrect is much more secure because it gives less information. But for a bot, which is really what you're most likely to be attacked by, this doesn't really do too much. The default unlock request info here as well for the attempts and the retry period is totally acceptable. One thing I do recommend doing is instantly lock out invalid username attempts, especially if you're the only one on your website. There's no reason that you should, if you're the only user on your website and you're not really concerned with this, most of the time what they do is they guess random iterations of the site name, an author name, or the admin/administrator. So if this is staging, they'll type in staging.com and try to make some iteration of the username with that. You can also include usernames to add to this list, and that will automatically block them if they attempt it. You can also choose to get notified by email. I don't recommend doing this. And there's an email login IP whitelist, which I recommend you add your home IP to. If you don't know how to do that, just go to Google and type in what is my IP address, copy the digits, and paste it here. We'll go ahead and save. The failed login records. This is just a recording of failed login attempts. And you can delete the information or export it as a CSV if you so wish. You could just do a force logout. What this does is it reduces how long users are logged into your admin panel. Say you get logged in, you set it to 60 minutes, you'll automatically be signed out every 60 minutes. This is a good thing to do if you're working in a shared environment. It's not really a major concern from a security or brute forcing point of view, but if you share a space with many other users who work, maybe you're in a shared working space and for some reason you don't lock your computer when you get up, you can at least sign out of your website. In my opinion, this is a silly thing that it gives you points for, but you can go ahead and enable it. 60 minutes is typically fine. If you're a longer rider, you could do like 240 for 4 hours, and that's still much shorter than the default period. The account activity logs, as it mentions here, there we go. I just got signed out. It'll mention when you log in, the login time period, the logout time period, and the IP address of the user. And then there's the logged in users, which will let you know of the currently signed in users. User registration allows you to enable a manual approval system. If you're a website where you have users register, maybe you're a membership website or a WooCommerce website, you can manually approve the registrations. Personally, though, this would be quite obnoxious. My typical recommendation is to use the next two options, but if you want to manually approve every user that registers, by all means, you can enable this and do so. Registration captcha, though, is where it actually begins to matter. You could check this to insert a captcha on the default WordPress registration page. I recommend this. I did a video on invisible captcha, no captcha, and I'll put it in the eye. But basically, you could set up a RE captcha, but only for the login pages for the default login and register, the BuddyPress registration page, as well as WooCommerce, and that pretty much covers everything. So that's what I would recommend you do. But if you want to use the default math type captcha that this has, you can enable it. Then there's a registration honeypot. A honeypot is basically a field that is invisible to humans and only visible to bots. And the bot will attempt to fill it out because they think it's required to sign in. But the issue with that is it's a field that when they fill it out, they're never able to submit that data. So basically they fill out the little thing with whatever snippet of information they have. Maybe it's just a random string of numbers. And it refuses to submit the data because WordPress can't actually take it. But because they've added data to that field, they're now stuck to where they can never submit it. And typically what happens is the bot will just bounce. And as it mentions here, which is attempting to register on your website, it'll be redirected to its own local host IP address. So the bot fills out this field, it goes to submit, it gets redirected to its own local host. It's a very smart system, and I wish that WordPress by default used honeypots. You have a database prefix. They don't recommend using the default WP prefix. This is good to a degree. As it mentions here, your WordPress database is likely to be hacked by an SQL injection. One way to add layer protection against that SQL injection is to change the default prefix. But I wouldn't drive yourself crazy with this. Typically, SQL injections only work if you have an active vulnerability on your website anyways. And if you're in a situation where you have an active vulnerability that can be exploited, this isn't going to save you. Really, the request should just outright be blocked, and you should be updating your plugins and your themes and WordPress on a regular basis. But some of you aren't, and you know who you are. But I would not rely on this as a means of protecting your website from SQL injections. But if you wish to change it, you can. I typically just leave it as WP because I like to use just SQL commands that I already have, and I can just use them for most of my other websites if I'm cleaning out the database manually. I did it today and I cleaned out like 5,000. I cleaned up 50% of my post meta table by removing unused data on my live site. The file system security allows you to effectively just make sure you're running recommended permissions. As you can see, apparently there's a bunch of permissions on this website that are not correct, and you can go ahead and set them to the recommended level. Keep in mind, though, that if you do this, you could run into issues. I'll go ahead and set it to something like HT access. And it looks like it was successfully changed. And it looks like it was... It says it was changed, but it actually wasn't. You know what? Here we'll go. We'll go ahead and set all the recommended permissions and make sure everything still works. Permissions have the advantage of preventing users from accessing the files and modifying directories if they have access to your admin panel in particular. It will scan the critical WordPress core filters and highlight anything that it deems insecure. Typically, these are fine and they don't cause any breakages. You go to the front end and everything is still visible. You only have a minor headache if you are trying to edit a file or a folder via the plugin editor or theme editor. You may have issues there. And also, depending on who has ownership of the files on the server, could be a whole separate issue. But that is what you deal with when you're working with file permissions. But these are good recommendations. I do recommend you employ them unless you have a specific setup that you know that these would not work in. PHP file editing. You should disable your WordPress plugin theme editor, flat out. There's never a good reason for you to have these enabled. You should always be editing via FTP or a file manager on your hosting platform. WP file access will prevent access to the default WordPress install files, which is the README, the license, and the WP config. These are really just used to send in or check for information. A bot will try to connect to these files to see what version of WordPress you're running. Personally, though, I don't really think that this is going to stop real hackers, because most of the time you get hacked because it's a bot who's testing known vulnerabilities. If it doesn't work, it goes to the next website in the list. So it's just another never-ending cycle. The host system file logs. This is just what your name is of the default system log. Error.log is the default. Nothing in here that you really need to do. The blacklist manager allows you to enable IP and user agent blacklisting. You basically enter the IP address or user agent you wish to block, and you will be fine. I must submit an IP address or a user agent or both. We're going to go with bad bot. All right, bad bot is now blocked from accessing this website. And there you go. You get all 15 points. As you can see, the point system is a little finicky, but this is totally fine. The bad bot is just a made-up bot that I came up with. You'll list out any IP addresses that you know are causing you spam. If you notice you're getting brute forced a lot from a specific set of IP addresses, block them completely in here, and then that will stop them dead in their tracks. I would also recommend blocking them in Cloudflare, and if you don't have that set up, I highly recommend you do so. But that is your options. Now, under the firewall settings, you get a couple of options in here which seem a little confusing, so we're going to try and break them down. The default firewall is meant to help against common vulnerabilities, as it mentions. It'll protect your HT access file. It will disable the server signature information. It will limit your upload size to 10 megs. The thought process there is that if somebody's trying to upload a large payload, sometimes what you'll see is hackers upload a large zip file of HTML files or image files to the server, and they use that to get SEO benefits by basically just kicking off your website and to spread their content around. This should help prevent that. It most of the time doesn't. And then it will protect your WP config file by denying access to it. Everything in here is fine, and you can also lower the upload size. Keep in mind though, this limits the upload size for you too. My server upload size, I believe I have it as a max of 25 megabytes anyways. And I think I was only doing that because I was testing a larger plugin, but I typically leave it at a default of 10 anyways. But this is a good workaround for you. The WordPress XML RPC and pingback, if unless you're using Jetpack, which means if you're using WooCommerce services as well, you need Jetpack. You can choose to completely block XML RPC or disable the pingback functionality from XML RPC. If you're using either one of these though, as it mentions right here, then you should enable this option. And this is correct. If you enable the completely block access to, you will break Jetpack altogether. Jetpack will not function. And WooCommerce services as a downside would also cease to function. So for most situations, you should probably disable pingback to be on the safe side. But if you know you're not using it, you can completely block access to it. On websites that I don't use Jetpack, and I am a fan of Jetpack personally, I will block access to it completely. And then you can also block access to the debug log files. That's good if you have WordPress debug enabled, but you don't want somebody to be able to read or access that logs. The additional firewall rules disable index views. If you've ever gone to a website and you can see, if you go to /wp-content on your website, so if you go to your homepage, just like this, and if you go to /wp-content, just the folder, and it lists out subfolders, you have Apache indexes enabled. This should be disabled immediately. That can allow somebody to explore your entire file system. You can figure out what plugins they're running. You can download their plugins. You can download any other uploads. You can see things on there that they don't necessarily want you to be able to see. In fact, I had a client who had a site redesigned, and their developer stored copies of every client site on their website, and it was in an Apache index file. And you could explore every website they were doing, every project they were working on. That is a major concern. So make sure that indexes are disabled. And then you can enable disable trace and track. As it mentions right here, the HTTP trace attack can be used to return header requests and grab the cookies. This just disables and prevents HTTP trace attack. You should be fine to do this for most websites. You could choose to forbid those who are using a proxy for commenting. As it says here, this will deny any requests that use a proxy server when posting comments. That's typically a good thing to do. Most users don't use a proxy. Now, I will say my own mobile device does set up a VPN if I connect onto a public Wi-Fi network that does not have a password set. So that is something to keep in mind. Mobile devices are getting smarter, and a lot of them are starting to add services like this, so you need to keep that in mind before you enable this option. It's probably a very small subset of your users, but still be very wary of this. If you have a Keysmet activated, you probably don't need this, but if you don't, go ahead and enable it. Deny bad query strings. Most of the time, you're not using query strings in your URLs. If you have plugins or themes that do it, a common one would be like a referral plugin or anything that's mildly complicated. If you're not running a standard WordPress blog, if you deny bad query strings, this could cause issues with those plugins and themes. But if you're running a simple website that has anything really complicated on it, you should be fine to go ahead and enable this. Advanced character string. As it mentions here, this will prevent malicious attacks on your site from cross-site scripting. The settings match for common malicious strings patterns and exploits and will produce a 403 error for a hacker attempting the query. As it mentions here, some strings for this setting may break functionality, and they recommend that you take a backup of your HT access file. For this website, it should totally be fine. because it's just a simple website. But the 6G blacklist firewall. The 6G firewall is a rules designed by Perishable Press, as it mentions, and it's meant to prevent common forms of hacking by just a subset of htaccess rules. You should be fine to go ahead and enable the 6G firewall rule. It shouldn't have any real impact on functionality. If you notice any errors, though, you can go ahead and disable it. You can try the 5G legacy firewall, but I don't see why you'd want to when you can have a newer one. And then block fake Google bots. I recommend just doing this in general. It'll block bots that pretend to be Googlebot. Prevent hot linking. This prevents a website from serving your image on their website. So if you go to your website, they'll copy the image URL or copy the image itself, paste it in their blog, write a blog post, and they're linking that image to the one on your server. So your server is serving the image to their visitors, so you're not getting any benefit from it. This prevents it. I typically recommend being careful with this setting. Sometimes, based on how your post, if you're having put your post embedded on other websites, this could cause issues. If you really just don't care, you can do this, but really, I don't recommend doing this. Just use the CDN like Cloudflare to provide a better user experience. 404 detection, don't enable this. It sounds like a good idea, but the problem is you're going to get a lot of information in here. Every time a iOS device will connect to your website and it tries to look for a URL that doesn't exist, which is the icon the iOS device used if it wants to add it as a bookmark, that can come up. I just don't, and you get a ton of spam and you'll get notices and it's just a long list and it's just a headache. I don't like it. You can add custom rules here. I don't see why you would do that. Brute force protection. You can rename your login page. As I mentioned, this is a give and a take feature. If you enable it, you may forget that URL. I've seen many clients that do that. Honestly, I use the Cloudflare method of locking down my admin panel URL, and that works the best for me. I wouldn't enable this to save myself the headache, but one of the easiest things that you can do to effectively cease all brute force attempts really is just to rename the URL to something only you know. The downside being, though, is sometimes a plugin may not work, a theme may not work because of the way they try to work with the login URL system. So just keep it in mind. Cookie-based brute force login prevention. All you should really need to do is enable this, and if either one of these settings are true, then you can just go ahead and check them. You can add a secret word, which can be used as your special URL, but you shouldn't really need to. You shouldn't really need this option with the other settings you have enabled. The login CAPTCHA, you can enable the Google RE CAPTCHA. It has to be the V2 widget, but it's just the invisible button that says I'm not a robot. You'll click the I'm not a robot button and it'll log you in. You can then choose where you want to enable that CAPTCHA, the login page, the password page, and the custom login form CAPTCHA settings. And I would just enable it on all of it. If you're really just searching for points, that is, like you don't really need to put a CAPTCHA on your last password page. You don't normally get your last password page as being a source of brute forcing or spammers. Most of the time they just don't do it. But you can. Login whitelist allows you to just whitelist a subset of IP addresses who can access your login page. This is a obnoxious feature, and it does mention here if you have either one of these, then you'll have these features are not functionally related, and having both of them means you'll have 2 layers of security. What this does is if somebody goes to your wp-login.php and it's not your current IP address that's entered below, they will not be able to access that URL. The problem with this is it's very annoying. Really, that is honestly the most obnoxious thing is you go to hire somebody and to maybe do some work on your website. Now you need to whitelist their IP address, or their IP address changes, or you're using something like Cloudflare, or you add Cloudflare later down the line. And now all the IP addresses are coming back as Cloudflare because you don't have the real IP being checked from the plugin, and now nobody can log in. So now you have to go and disable the plugin, and you just start getting into this mess of frustration. But you can do this. It's just really annoying. And my preferred method of trying to lock down the admin panel again is to do it through Cloudflare, because you can modify the firewall rules. The honeypot field should be enabled for the login page, as you would expect. The spam prevention, you can add a caption to your comment forms. This is a quick way to ever kill any chance of you getting comments, because captchas are annoying. People kind of live with captchas when they're registering for services now, but I can promise you they're not going to want to deal with one in the comment section. Just use a keysmet. It's just much better for everybody. Then you could just block spam bots from posting. It basically has a list of words that it detects as somebody trying to... It really just checks it. Well, it also checks the HTTP refer, making sure that it is set, and if it's not, it blocks the user. This is what I would use. Comment spam IP monitoring. You can enable auto block of comment spam IPs if it's considered and submitted and marked as spam. I recommend doing that. This features detect that a keysmet is not active. You should activate a keysmet. They will work together. If you have somebody who comments on the website and a keysmet says this is spam, well, all-in-one will say, oh, this is a spam user from this IP address. Well, we'll add it to our blacklist so that way they can't brute force the website. They can't comment anymore. It's just a good way of integrating the two systems to prevent your website from getting attacked more. Frankly, this is something I wish more services would integrate. A keysmet's great because it just compiles so much information. You get thousands upon thousands of spam comments on a fairly active website. However, there isn't an easy way to feed that data into something more useful like Cloudflare. Really, if you could feed a keysmet data into Cloudflare, you'd be set. But you can't, not easily. There's probably an API to set it up, but there's not a very very brilliant. Add a plugin and it does it for you. So this is a good option. The BuddyPress and BBPress are specific to that plugin. It will allow you to add the CAPTCHA to their various login and commenting sections. The scanner. So the scanner will drive you nuts every once in a while. So it will scan any file, then determine if it was modified or not, including WordPress files. As in general, WordPress core files are such as PHP and JS and should not change often. I don't like this personally as a way of detecting malware, because these files do get false flagged all the time. Even with WordFence, you see that they're false flagged. I don't recommend enabling this option in all honesty. It's just not an efficient way of detecting malware on your website. Maintenance mode, you can choose to throw up a maintenance screen if you wish. Kind of cool. Now, miscellaneous has some weirder features. So you can enable copy protection, which disables right-clicking. Don't do this. This is such a horribly dumb and annoying thing for users. If somebody is trying to share your post on Twitter, for instance, they'll probably want to copy a snippet to make a comment. So somebody reads it and puts a quote, and then we'll share your URL on Twitter. Bots aren't going to be stopped by this system. Typically, this is just using some kind of JS library, and most of the time, bots and scrapers just don't run JavaScript. And I find this more frustrating from a user experience point of view. And whenever I typically go in and I optimize a website or I'm doing work on it, I say, you should disable this because it's annoying and it doesn't actually stop bots, and that typically puts the end of it. Enable iframe protection. As this mentions here, this allows you to prevent other sites from displaying any of your content via an iframe. I don't really know what problem this is trying to solve necessarily, but you can do this if you don't want somebody iframing your website. And one thing to keep in mind is that WordPress has an embed system, which allows a website or a post from a website to be embedded on another WordPress website. I'm not sure if this is going to cause issues with that, even because it is an embed system. It shouldn't. Maybe it will. I just don't see this solving any major issue for your website. This is actually a useful bit of a feature. What this does allows you to prevent bots, as it says, from trying to find URL info from a author. The author pages do show the username of the user. and it can be retrieved just like this. If you go to this URL on here, we'll paste it in and we will go to it, and it should return my author name. So it returns the name. Keep that in mind. I actually do recommend that you disable it. In most situations, you're just simply not going to care if this feature is on or not. And then finally, you have the REST API option. You can choose to disable REST API access for non-logged in users. However, now in 2020, a lot of plugins use this. Contact Form 7 is a very major one. It will block REST API requests that these plugins do because they are not being done from a user who is logged in. My typical recommendation for this is not to use this. Unless you have a really custom website that you can guarantee nothing is using the REST API on, disabling the REST API for non-logged in users almost always causes more issues than it is trying to resolve. So we've gone through and we've enabled the general features, and I only got a 310 out of 515. It really makes you wonder with all these options, what really matters? Oh, file permission. Sure, I'll turn that on. Has no idea what it did. Oh, the WP config file changed. I think that's because he had to edit it for his own setting. Okay, now I got a 330 out of 515. That's a score I can live with. It's definitely not perfect. My problem with this is, wow, this has like been going on for half an hour, and yeah, your site's more secure, but I don't see a lot of features in here that I would just use this plugin for, and I don't see why I would pay for their scanner. If you could give me your own personal experience with this plugin, I'd love to hear it. I've used it in the past, but honestly, the sheer amount of settings, the emails, and just how it didn't ever really work was what really made me stop using it. And then I swapped people to using WordFence. The WordFence free, and then those who want to pay for more obviously pay for better service. But that's all I have to say. If you like the video, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe, and if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to put them in the comment section below.